A flight attendant stepped on the family dog mid-flight, but the baby's cry signaled that the father was about to take control, and the cabin froze in shock. A flight attendant stepped on his dog's tail, thinking no one would notice. He didn't realize the baby's cry was a signal, triggering the father's immediate response. The moment that yelp echoed, the cabin's balance of power shifted. Subscribe. If you believe arrogance collapses, the second true strength shows up. Dr. Cale Marvin stepped onto Airwind Flight 309 and immediately felt the shift, the subtle transition from airport chaos to the artificially calm cabin of controlled altitude. He didn't pause. With his daughter strapped tightly against his chest in her soft carrier, he moved down the narrow aisle, body angled to shield her from brushing passengers. Her breath was warm against his collarbone, a small rhythmic puff that matched the hum of the jet. At his side, Cor trotted in perfect sync, ears tilted slightly, posture low but alert. The dog's gait was practiced, silent, calibrated. This was not just a pet. This was a trained neuro-response sentinel, and he read environments faster than Cale could. They reached row 3 without incident, until a shadow blocked the aisle. "Animals go back there," said a flat voice. Cale stopped. Not abruptly, but with the kind of composed deceleration born from years of reading social triggers before they erupted. He looked up. The man was tall, maybe mid-40s, clean-shaven with cheekbones sharp enough to slice paper. His name tag read Riven Doss, and his arms were folded across his vest, stance planted as if preparing for resistance. His gaze was unreadable, not hostile, not polite. Just blank, like an algorithm awaiting input. Cale shifted slightly so Riven's weight was balanced, then reached into the side of his jacket. Without a word, he held up the laminated clearance badge issued by Airwind's pre-boarding compliance unit, printed, signed, and digitally verified with timestamp authentication. It granted Cor full seat access rights due to his role in Cale's clinical research protocols. Riven glanced at the badge, a faint twitch of the jaw. His arms didn't unfold. After a long pause, he moved half a step aside, just enough to let them pass. "Appreciate your cooperation," Cale said, voice calm, professional. Riven didn't answer. Cale eased into the row, unclipping the carrier's side buckle to allow Riven more comfort while keeping her close. Cor circled once, then settled beneath the seat in a tight, curled position, head resting on his front paws, eyes tracking the aisle. Cale took note. That was not Cor's usual resting pattern. Something in the environment had already put him in semi-alert mode. The flight continued boarding. A wave of passengers flowed past, a mix of businessmen with folded newspapers, young men in sweatshirts juggling devices, and a few solitary travelers already searching for armrest dominance. Cale observed them with practiced detachment. Every movement, every facial expression was data to him. Years of mapping human response patterns had trained his mind to see more than most people noticed. But as he adjusted Riven's head, now tucked softly into his shoulder, he noticed something else. Riven again. The attendant walked past their row once, then again, then a third time. Each pass was slower, closer. The second time, Riven lingered as he adjusted a bin across from Cale's seat. The third time, he brushed past with a little too much presence, just close enough that Cor's body tensed beneath the seat. Not a flinch, just a shift, like a loaded spring acknowledging pressure. Cale didn't move, but he saw it. He glanced at the business-class mirror mounted to reflect the overhead compartments. Riven's face flickered into view, just for a second. No smile, no expression. But Cale saw it. The kind of clinical stillness he recognized from the observation decks at his own lab. Not disinterest. Calculation. Across the aisle, a man in a slate suit leaned toward Cale slightly. "Dog seems anxious," he said with a polite nod. Cale acknowledged him. "He's protective, especially of her." The man said nothing further but gave a subtle look toward Riven's retreating back, then returned to his tablet. Cale resumed monitoring. He didn't speak, didn't escalate, he simply watched. Then came the fourth pass. Riven moved to the bin above row 2, pulled it open slowly as though inspecting the contents. But Cale noticed his foot, specifically the tap, twice against the compartment's lower panel, a rhythmic motion that didn't fit any obvious task. Then Riven looked directly at seat 3B, at Cale. The stare lasted less than a second, but the message was there. Not a threat, not even a warning, just acknowledgement of something. Core lifted his head, ears slightly forward now, body low but alert. Cale exhaled slowly and whispered under his breath, almost unconsciously. Sometimes the dog speaks before the human realizes he's listening. Riven Doss passed again. That made 5 times. Cale Marvin didn't shift in his seat, didn't raise his head, didn't even move his hand from where it rested against Core's collar. But inside, he was counting, timing, mapping. The cabin was almost full now, a slow rhythm of overhead compartments slamming and seatbelt buckles clicking into place. Riven, nestled close in her chest carrier, gave a soft, uncertain whimper. Cale gently tapped the side of the harness, a signal they had trained into her months ago. Just a touch, just enough to create the tiniest rhythm her body could recognize as safe. A signal. Ground yourself. I'm here. Core's body tensed slightly under the seat, then relaxed again, but never fully. The dog's head tracked Riven with surgical precision, dark eyes following every step the attendant took down the narrow aisle. His ears were alert but not raised, tail still but flexed. This wasn't fear, it was observation. Cale didn't speak. He simply turned his attention toward the overhead bin reflection in the window across from them, using it as a periphery mirror. He watched Riven pause briefly near row 2, pretending to adjust a ceiling latch, but his body dipped lower than needed. His right foot tapped the metallic side panel, twice. Tap. Tap. Kyle blinked. The movement wasn't accidental. No one tapped their shoe like that while adjusting luggage. The gesture had the timing of a signal, not a stumble. Then came the glance. Riven turned his head, not to scan the cabin, not to look casually around, but to settle his gaze directly on Cale's seat. Not a stare, just a check, confirmation. The message was quiet, almost invisible. You're being marked. Cale's grip on the carrier strap tightened for half a second. Riven stirred again. A soft yawn, followed by a faint hiccup of uncertainty. Core shifted his weight. Not a growl, just a movement, but one charged with tension. Across the aisle, a man in a tailored navy suit with silver cufflinks leaned slightly closer, gesturing toward Core with a polite nod. "Dog seems anxious," the man remarked, tone low but curious. Cale didn't glance away from Riven. "He's protective," he replied quietly, "especially of her." The suited man nodded and returned to his tablet. But Cale's focus stayed on Riven, who now moved toward the front, then doubled back with no explanation. Again. Why? Why so many passes? Why linger near row 3 when the galley was at the back and the service duties didn't require this loop? Cale had logged hundreds of flights in his career. Flight attendants didn't walk this way unless they had a reason or a role. He leaned slightly, pretending to adjust the blanket draped over his knees, while subtly glancing down at Core's posture. The dog was still in a perfect service position, head low, body tucked, but the muscles beneath his coat were wound like steel cables. It wasn't the motion that triggered Core, it was the pacing, the rhythm. Cale had seen similar patterns in behavioral conditioning trials, where animals responded not just to threats, but to predictive movements that signaled danger before it arrived. He tapped the harness once more. Riven's body relaxed for a moment, but Cale's mind was racing now, reconstructing Riven's exact steps since boarding. First, the refusal at the door, Then the tight jaw when Cale presented the dog's clearance badge. Then the unnatural frequency of his walk-bys. Each event small on its own, but in sequence, it painted something else. A behavioral probe, a provocation test. Cale had seen these techniques in government training simulations. Small invasions of space, lingering eye contact, encoded gestures, observational loops designed to elicit subconscious stress reactions. The subject doesn't react the first time, or the second, but by the fifth, the brain starts to pattern match. Core had already done that. Cale exhaled slowly through his nose. Then, just as he leaned back into the seat cushion, Riven passed by once more, this time pretending to adjust a seatbelt in row 2. Another tap. 2 beats. Metallic. Sharp. Tap. Tap. Cale angled his tablet just slightly to capture the overhead reflection again. This time he caught it. The tiniest smirk on Riven's lips before he moved on. That was no accident. Cale turned toward the window and blinked slowly, his breath steadying. This wasn't a coincidence. It was coordinated. But coordinated with who? He scanned the rows behind them quickly. Faces, postures, eye lines. Nothing obvious. But that didn't mean it wasn't there. He'd been marked for something. Whether it was a simple test of composure, an illegal biometric probe, or something deeper, Cale didn't yet know. But he was no longer just a passenger. He was now a variable in someone else's equation. And Core knew it too. The dog's head lifted by an inch when Riven passed again, as if to say, "I saw that." Cale adjusted his grip on Riven's harness and let his voice murmur so low it was almost inaudible. Not everything on a flight is turbulence. The heel came down hard. Without warning, Riven's boot landed squarely on the ridge of Core's tail with a force that betrayed intention. The sound was immediate, a sharp, pained yelp that sliced through the quiet hum of the cabin. Core recoiled, his body jerking backward in instinctive defense, his nails scratching faintly against the cabin floor as he tried to shrink from the source of the pain. Cale's breath caught mid-thought. The tablet in his lap slid sideways as he pushed halfway out of his seat, one arm reflexively shielding Riven, who had jolted awake with a scream of her own, piercing, panicked, inconsolable. "Step back," Cale said, his voice low and taut, each syllable wound with restraint stretched to its limit. Riven didn't move. He stood there, his posture indifferent, hands still resting on the drink cart handle. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look sorry. He simply stared at Cale with a cold, unreadable calm, his gaze flicking briefly down at Core, then up at Riven, before settling back on Cale like someone watching a lab result unfold. "Animals shouldn't be up here," Riven muttered, almost to himself. Core whimpered again, the sound muffled but heart-wrenching, his ears flat against his skull, his tail now tucked tightly to his side, trembling. The dog didn't growl, didn't bite, just stared up at Cale with an expression only a trained companion could carry. Confusion, apology, and patience, all buried under pain. Around them, the cabin stirred, a rustle of fabric, a startled whisper. Someone unbuckled, then quickly sat back down when a seatbelt chime echoed overhead. The moment had disrupted the cabin's fragile peace, but not enough to incite intervention. Not yet. Not when the aggressor was wearing a uniform and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Cale didn't sit back down. He remained half-standing, muscles taut, his daughter's cries stabbing through his ears with every second. She writhed in the carrier, her hands flailing, her head turned against his chest as if to burrow into the safety she had once trusted without question. Kyle swayed slightly to soothe her, but his attention stayed locked on Riven. His mind, even through the emotional spike, was cataloging everything. Body angle, trajectory, timing. That was no accident. Riven hadn't stumbled. The cabin floor was clear. The drink cart had space. The approach angle was too direct, too centered. No, this wasn't a mistake. This was a test. Or worse, a trigger. Cale's eyes darted upward toward the nearest overhead bin, where a narrow convex mirror gave a partial fisheye view of the aisle. He caught a sliver of Riven's face in the reflection. His jaw wasn't clenched in embarrassment or guilt. It was relaxed. His brow was not furrowed in apology. It was lifted slightly, as though anticipating something, watching for a response, measuring it. Cale's gut tightened. This wasn't about a dog. It wasn't even about protocol. This was a probe, a behavioral provocation cloaked in the mundane. From behind, a passenger leaned forward slightly, whispering, "Everything okay up there?" The voice was male, uncertain, hesitant. Kyle didn't turn. He couldn't afford to shift his posture. He simply said, "We're fine," while making sure Riven's carrier stayed flush against his chest and Core remained positioned between his legs and the seat base. Riven moved at last, slowly, unbothered. He took one small step back with a faint mechanical squeak from the drink cart. Then he gave a quick, rehearsed smile to the nearest passenger and continued down the aisle, as if nothing had happened. Kyle sat, but only partially. One knee hovered. He tapped the edge of his tablet, calling up a black screen with a glowing symbol in the corner. A background process activated. He didn't open the app fully. Not yet. Just enough to let it start buffering cabin audio from the ambient mic embedded in the tablet's frame. Core let out a low exhale, still curled but no longer trembling. Kyle placed a hand gently on the dog's back, feeling the tension slowly release under his palm. Riven, however, hadn't calmed. She continued to cry, softer now, but raw and jagged, like her small body didn't know whether to scream or hide. Cale's mind flashed back to a seminar he once gave on trauma-induced behavior. He had shown clips of infants crying not from hunger or fear, but from mirroring. From the moment their caregivers flinched, their pets yelped, or their environment shifted. A shared biological alert system. Cale had spent years mapping it. Now he was living it. Riven's footsteps faded down the aisle, but Cale didn't relax. He leaned slightly to the side and angled the tablet toward the seat back in front of him, checking the corner reflection again. Riven hadn't once looked back, because he didn't need to. He had already seen what he wanted. Cale blinked slowly, forcing his breath into a controlled rhythm. His thoughts were racing, but one truth stood out with crisp certainty. This wasn't random. This wasn't a one-off moment of cruelty or a lapse in professionalism. It was calculated, practiced, and, most dangerously, observed. Core nudged Cale's leg with his nose. A small gesture. Grounding. Kyle reached down and squeezed his paw lightly in return. Outside the window, clouds passed in slow motion, their peaceful drift a jarring contrast to the silent war unfolding inside. Kyle could almost hear his own lecture playing in his head, as if narrated from a distance. In high-stress environments, triggers are not always obvious. Sometimes they wear a name tag and push a cart. He looked down at Riven. Her sobs were quieting into rhythmic hiccups. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes red, but her hands had stopped flailing. She clung now instead, her fingers twisted into the fabric of his shirt. Cale gently tapped her side, a code he'd used since her earliest weeks. 2 light taps, then a pause. It meant, "You're safe. I'm here. We're grounded." She responded with a small inhale, deeper than the rest. Recognition. Trust. Cale's eyes narrowed slightly. His hand hovered above the tablet. He wasn't ready to play all his cards, but he was done observing in silence. Because now he had more than suspicion. He had a pattern. And behind that pattern was an intent. The baby's cry wasn't random. It was a response to an attack meant for all 3 of them. The moment Riven's boot slammed down on Core's tail, Cale felt a war within himself. His spine had stiffened. His instincts screamed to retaliate. But instead, he sat down. Control. That was the only word echoing through his mind. Not silence, not fear. Control. He reached down and gently placed a hand on Core's back. The dog trembled beneath his palm, muscles taut, breath ragged, eyes locked in a direction Cale didn't need to check. Riven was gone now, cart wheeled away, leaving behind the ripples of pain and confusion. The cabin still hadn't fully settled. A few passengers whispered. Riven's earlier wails had died down to soft hiccups, but her little hand clung tightly to the front of Cale's shirt, gripping tighter than usual. Cale inhaled once through his nose, then exhaled slowly. He wasn't going to confront Riven in public. Not yet. The system didn't reward outrage, it punished it, especially from fathers with dogs and babies, especially those who refused to be rattled. Instead, Cale tapped the service call button. The new face who approached wasn't Riven. Good. It was a young male attendant, barely in his 20s, with the name tag Kelrick. His movements were slightly anxious but not unkind. "Sir, is everything all right?" Kyle kept his voice low, calm, professional. "I need to file a formal injury report. My service dog was deliberately stepped on, with force, by crew." Kelrick blinked. "Deliberately?" "Yes," Cale said. "I'll submit footage if necessary, but I also want a time-stamped log of crew movement near row 3 and clarification on which in-cabin camera zones are operational." Kelrick hesitated. His hand shifted toward the pocket of his tablet unit but stopped short. Cale leaned forward slightly. "And for what it's worth, I'm not the only one watching. Row 2 and 5 passengers noticed the incident. You might want to confirm that before brushing this off." The young man's composure wavered. He looked over his shoulder, then back at Cale. His voice dropped to a whisper. "We've had other concerns filed about Riven." Cale's mind narrowed in an instant. There it is. The phrasing wasn't accidental. Other concerns implied a pattern, a trail, possibly even buried cases. He leaned back. "Then I recommend you don't waste time hesitating." Kelrick swallowed hard. "I'll notify the purser," he said, then quickly stepped away. Cale didn't wait. He reached for the lower buckle of Riven's carrier, just under her left shoulder, and pressed his thumb beneath a stitched flap. A soft click pulsed through the harness. Invisible to others, but critical. The embedded biometric node had activated. Data now streamed wirelessly into his tablet's internal cache, emotional telemetry, muscular tension, ambient pressure shifts. Originally designed to log child response data during Cale's field studies, it was now serving another purpose entirely: documentation. He opened the stream, tapped for playback. There it was, clear as day. T-minus 5.8 seconds before Riven's scream, her anxiety vitals had spiked sharply. Her heart rate had jumped 17 beats per minute. Her oxygen intake narrowed. The spike was not just reactive, it was anticipatory. She had sensed something before the pain. Cale added Core's data overlay. The dog's readings told a parallel story: elevated respiration, minor cortisol surge, tightening of shoulder musculature. A slight tremor in the left hind leg registered milliseconds before the tail crush incident. Core had braced, not against turbulence, against danger. It confirmed what Cale already suspected. Both child and dog had sensed the intent before the impact. And if they had, then Riven's actions weren't a slip of the boot. They were calculated. He opened a new log entry, documenting the timestamp, telemetry overlays, and behavioral match notes. His fingers moved quickly but quietly. He annotated patterns with terms from his research: pre-event synchrony, anticipatory mirror response, multi-species resonance. Not for publication. Not yet. This wasn't a paper. This was defense. A few rows ahead, a familiar clack made his head rise. Riven was returning, this time from the galley side, the same side he had tapped earlier with his shoe during boarding. Cale's mind clicked into place. He rewound that memory. Riven had leaned into the bin, tapped his foot against the aluminum frame twice, and then looked directly toward Cale's seat. He hadn't adjusted anything. There had been no misplaced luggage. It was a signal. The panel. That side of the cabin, the galley bulkhead, was one of the few areas known to contain a partial camera panel, mainly for turbulence response and crew tracking. Cale's fingers paused over his tablet screen. The camera might have captured Riven's approach. If so, there would be footage, not from directly over row 3, but from a diagonal angle that included Riven's forward lean and step. Combined with the data from Core and Riven, it could form an undeniable triangle of evidence. He needed access to that feed, but Kelrick had already implied that the camera logs were limited. Still, Cale wasn't helpless. He leaned back again, adjusted Riven's carrier more snugly, and pressed 2 fingers into the inner strap that wrapped across her torso. Another click, another signal. This one connected the carrier's harness node directly to Cale's forensic subroutine, an experimental protocol he'd been developing for live sensory behavioral modeling. It included adaptive timestamp syncing across environmental stimuli, which meant even if he didn't have full video access, he could reconstruct a predictive movement map from Core and Riven's positioning data alone. The setup wasn't perfect, but it didn't have to be. It had to be enough to make the next denial look like evasion. Just then, Riven stirred, letting out a soft, questioning hum. Not distressed, just uncertain. Her little eyes blinked open, catching Kyle's face. He met her gaze, brushed her forehead with the back of his knuckle. "You felt it before I did, didn't you?" he murmured quietly. The baby blinked again, as if she'd understood. Kyle exhaled slowly and pulled up the earliest reading on her record. It marked a pattern he'd seen before only in lab conditions: cross-linked anticipatory distress. In his studies, this usually only surfaced in high-empathy test pairs, animal and infant bonded through prolonged exposure. Riven and Core. They had both felt it, and that made Cale certain. This wasn't random. This wasn't turbulence. This was targeted behavioral provocation, designed to trigger a response that could be used against them, possibly logged, possibly escalated. He looked toward the front of the cabin once more. Riven was nowhere in sight, but his echo lingered, etched into data, into sensors, into skin. Cale's fingers tightened around the tablet. He would not be baited. He would build, silently, carefully, precisely, and when it came time, he would present the facts, not for argument, but for reckoning. Because a baby's cry may be instinct, but fear that precise is often inherited from someone who's already seen the danger. Cale tapped the side of his tablet, initiating a custom-built interface that bloomed to life with clinical precision. The screen displayed a grid of biometric markers, heartbeat pulses, and sensory thresholds, data streaming from both Riven's embedded harness and Core's subdermal sync module. His fingers moved with muscle memory as he activated a subroutine originally designed for mapping canine empathy resonance during synchronized stress modeling, but today it would serve another purpose. His jaw tightened as he adjusted the input fields. He fed the program the exact timestamps from Riven's last anxiety spike and Core's tail flicker prior to the stomp. Then he overlaid Riven's movement log, not the official one, which the purser had refused to give, but one Cale had been logging manually since boarding. The movements, the glances, the distance-to-seat calculations. Every motion Riven made near row 3 had been mentally tagged and time-stamped in Cale's memory. The algorithm began to process. Across the scrolling visualization, sharp pulses flared in coordinated symmetry. Cale's eyes narrowed. Every 12 minutes, like a metronome, Riven had passed their row, brushing just within Riven's sensory radius. Each time he had lingered, never speaking, never engaging, just being there long enough to trigger low-level unease. But the duration, 4.3 seconds. Precisely. Repeatedly. The software flagged it as statistically abnormal. Cale leaned back slightly, tension radiating through his spine. This wasn't random behavior. It wasn't coincidence or cabin flow. It was a protocol, a loop, and the tail stomp had been the fourth such approach. Core's behavior made more sense now. The dog had endured the pain without retaliation. His eyes had tracked Riven's every pass, but he hadn't growled or barked. He was waiting, assessing, behavioral pause under duress. Cale had seen that posture before, in trauma recovery dogs trained to suppress their instinct until confirmation of threat. It was the posture of a companion trained to protect without giving an excuse to provoke removal. Cale glanced toward the galley mirror, pretending to adjust Riven's carrier. Behind them, the cabin continued with its artificial calm, passengers flipping magazines, screens glowing with muted movies, idle chatter broken by the occasional cough. Then Riven appeared again. This time, he didn't pause at row 3. He walked past, almost too casually, and leaned toward a man 2 rows back. Broad-shouldered, bald, wearing a nondescript gray pullover and khaki slacks, the man looked like any other frequent flyer. But Cale saw the whisper, saw the man's jaw twitch, and saw him nod once. Cale turned his head a fraction, enough to catch the interaction in his peripheral. Then he subtly adjusted Riven's harness strap outward. Embedded just below the fleece trim was a directional audio sensor. The modification had been for Cale's original research trials, an unobtrusive method of recording parent-infant vocal alignment during environmental stress, but now it had a new task. The sensor lit green. Recording. Riven's breathing had softened, but Cale knew her nervous system was still engaged. He tapped a setting on his tablet, feeding her vitals into the active thread. Above her pulse graph, Core's biometric overlay pulsed in synchronized rhythm. Kyle didn't just have data. He had layered evidence, living proof that both of them, child and animal, had registered the same incoming pattern. That meant the stimulus wasn't only detectable, it was intentional. The broad man shifted in his seat, then stood. Cale kept his expression blank, eyes on the tablet. He heard the steps approaching, slow, measured, deliberate. Core's ears twitched first, then pinned back. The dog didn't growl. He simply adjusted posture, placing his weight subtly between Cale's legs and the aisle. The man stopped right beside them. "Bathroom line's too long up front. I'll go back." The statement was unremarkable, ordinary even, but the context made Cale's breath still. Riven, standing near the galley, gave the man a quick nod and turned away, unconcerned. That reaction alone made Cale sit straighter in his seat. The turbulence in his chest had nothing to do with altitude. Core's low growl began before footsteps were even audible. The dog, injured but vigilant, lifted his head and stiffened, hackles rising. Cale placed a calm hand on the harness and whispered, "Stay," barely loud enough for even Riven to hear. The baby stirred in the carrier, her head pressing against his chest with a soft whimper, the vibration small but telling. The bald man neared row 3. He didn't stop, didn't glance, but just as he passed Cale's seat, he shifted his weight slightly and reached up as though adjusting his cufflink. His mouth moved without expression. "You've been flagged," he muttered, the words surgical in their precision. Cale's eyes stayed forward. "By who?" he asked, voice quiet but controlled. The man's tone never changed. "Keep your dog still, or they'll quarantine him." Then he kept walking, never breaking stride, disappearing down the aisle. Cale's hand gripped the armrest tightly, fingertips whitening with pressure. Core gave a tiny whine, a mix of discomfort and restrained instinct, but didn't move. Kyle pressed 2 fingers under the tray table and gave the "stay" signal. The dog obeyed instantly, posture tight but obedient. The warning hadn't been shouted. It didn't need to be. It was designed like a scalpel, precise, sharp, and impossible to ignore. A signal not of violence, but of pressure. Systemic, sanctioned pressure. Cale let the man vanish from view, then quietly leaned forward and tapped the top right corner of his stylus, twice in rapid succession. The tablet's screen remained dark, but he knew what it triggered. A dormant subroutine buried deep within the OS, a legacy code he and his former lab partner Lennox had developed years ago, before the accident. Log, track, loop, alert. A silent cascade of security protocols engaged behind the scenes. One by one, camera relays from the cabin's ambient sensors were accessed. The tablet began buffering a mosaic: low-angle views, aisle motion detectors, seat pressure patterns. What had once been intended to track neural rhythm shifts during high-empathy interactions was now capturing behavior under duress. Behind the tablet's sleep screen, a multi-angle recording began. Wide lens from the galley corner, underseat motion tracker, even faint biometric streams piggybacked from the aircraft's outdated entertainment network. He hadn't built it to spy. He'd built it for accuracy. But accuracy, Cale thought grimly, was sometimes the only shield against narratives rewritten mid-air. Riven stirred again. Cale pressed his palm to her back, syncing her emotional vitals with a biometric pulse from the embedded harness patch. He watched as her levels jumped, not drastically, but enough to confirm her unease. She'd heard the man's tone, even if she didn't understand the words. The brain noticed what language often missed. He glanced at Core, who remained still but alert, muscles taut beneath the short black fur. The dog's gaze flicked back and forth across the aisle, not in panic, but in pattern recognition. Cale saw it now, what Core had sensed even earlier: proximity tracking. Every time Riven passed, every time someone hovered too long near their row, Core responded, measured, contained, but consistent. This wasn't random. It wasn't emotional bias. It was orchestrated. Cale's breathing slowed as he pulled up the live data stream from his tablet's parallel feed. 3 biometric signatures aligned in the last 15 minutes: Riven, Core, and now himself. All 3 had synchronized surges during the man's approach, and the moment of the whispered threat. A spike across all 3 profiles. His mind raced, not with fear, but with structured suspicion. What if this wasn't about him personally? What if it was procedural? Cale remembered a note from an internal policy review months ago, something about escalations, behavioral flags, and unverified biometric collection mid-flight. It had sounded hypothetical then. But now? His thoughts were broken by Riven's return. The flight attendant moved slower this time, no cart, no distraction. Just presence. Cale didn't look at him, but he felt it. The weight of calculated proximity. He returned his focus to the screen. The tablet's code was still live. Ambient recording, 94%. Neural variance, climbing. Emotional duress threshold, nearly tripped. If Core reacted physically, lunged, barked, even stood up suddenly, it would provide all the justification they needed. The protocol clause he remembered kicked in at perceived animal threat. From there, mid-flight detainment, mandatory quarantine, data seizure, he couldn't let it happen. Every part of the plan, every threat, every warning, it all hinged on making them react. But Cale wasn't just reacting. He was watching, waiting, logging. Behind the facade of silence, a storm was brewing, not of fear, but of precision. Cale adjusted his grip on the stylus once more. A secondary pulse triggered from the back panel, small, silent, unnoticed. It connected to a backup cloud server maintained by his institute's ethics division. One alert and a real-time log would be streamed to secure review. He glanced at his daughter. Her eyes were open now, unfocused, but scanning. She tilted her head softly and let out a low, uncertain sound. Not a cry, just a tremble of recognition. Cale exhaled. Everything had changed. This wasn't just a bad interaction. It was a test, and they were the data. What began as cruelty had a deeper goal, and Cale was beginning to see the outline through the pressure. Cale didn't notice the turbulence until the plastic cup on his tray shifted slightly, water sloshing at the rim. The captain's voice crackled overhead with a warning of light shaking ahead, but it was the unease inside Cale that stirred more violently. He wasn't concerned with atmospheric currents. His focus was locked on the internal pressure rising, pressure not measured in altimeters, but in patterns, glances, and strategic pacing. The man behind him, the one with the bald head and thick forearms, had now relocated to row 7. Cale watched his reflection through the thin strip of the window across the aisle. The man had a notepad out, scribbling something furiously, eyes occasionally flicking toward Cale's row. Notes or data? He moved with purpose, the type only found in operatives who think their presence is too subtle to detect. But Cale had trained for this, studied behavioral pretext, micro-pattern deception, and strategic compliance cues. This wasn't subtle. It was structured. A shadow fell across him. "Water," came Riven's voice. Cale looked up. The flight attendant stood close, too close, his arm extended with a bottle. His expression was blank, but his stance wasn't. There was tension in the angle of his elbow, in the slight pressure he used to press the bottle forward. Kyle didn't move to take it. Riven leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "You're not a priority passenger, sir. Might be best to switch seats with your dog." Cale's gaze didn't flinch. His voice was quiet, direct. "That a joke?" Riven's smile was thin, brittle. He leaned closer still, and the air between them stiffened. "Not at all," he murmured. "But if something happens to him, don't say I didn't warn you." Then, just as quickly, he straightened and walked away, his steps even, as if the threat had never left his mouth. Riven whimpered. The sound pierced Cale's chest like a pin pressed too far. It wasn't just a cry. It was a somatic echo, a mirrored vibration of his own rising anxiety. Cale's hand moved instinctively to the carrier, brushing against her back, steadying her, steadying himself. She settled slightly, but her hiccup of distress lingered. Beneath the seat, Core growled. Not loud, not overt, but unmistakable. His ears pinned backward, his muscles low and braced. Cale didn't need to see the data to know, but he opened the tablet anyway. He navigated past the behavioral log into the in-flight systems panel. Masked under diagnostics he'd buried 3 layers deep. There it was, the in-flight device directory. Normally locked, but he had his ways. 2 unauthorized MAC addresses blinked in stealth mode. One showed up near the galley. Expected. The second? Cale's eyes narrowed. The second signal was pinging from his own row. That shouldn't have been possible. He tapped the diagnostic overlay, watching the signal fluctuate. It wasn't just sitting idle. It was actively syncing, scanning for proximity cues, triggering feedback pulses on a metered rhythm. Every 6.3 seconds, a scan, a log, a record. Cale's breath slowed, not from calm, but from focus. The implications struck like a turbine blade. The enemy hadn't just boarded the plane. He hadn't just assaulted Core or baited Cale into a reaction. He had plugged into the very infrastructure of the flight. They weren't targeting him physically. They were monitoring the response profile of an entire family unit. Cale, Riven, Core, all emotionally tethered, all now producing reaction data under manufactured threat pressure. That meant this wasn't about aggression. It was about thresholds. Core's growl intensified just for a second, then receded with Cale's quiet hand gesture, a practiced signal of calm. The dog responded instantly, pressing low to the floor again, eyes tracking. Cale looked forward. Riven had returned to the galley, his back to the aisle, pretending to arrange trays. But his hand, Cale noticed, wasn't moving. He was listening, observing, waiting for a spike. The setup was too precise, too rehearsed. Riven was playing a part he'd likely played before, and Cale, he was cast without consent into a simulation masquerading as a flight. Why target him? Why now? He pulled open a secondary log window and mapped Riven's recent vitals against Core's behavioral microshifts. The pattern was startling. At each of Riven's passes, Riven's cortisol levels had twitched, then dipped, then twitched again. Core's heart rate followed the same sawtooth slope, as if their bodies were tuning forks, struck in sequence. The man in row 7 scribbled something again. Cale's screen blinked, a minor latency error. That shouldn't have happened, unless someone else was pinging the feed. He glanced toward the overhead bin. The panel above Riven's previous tapping point had a faint smudge, 2 streaks, like a shoe had pressed against it more than once. A signal marker. Cale leaned back, tablet still open in his lap, the page masked as a child's drawing app. But the subroutine was active beneath it, mapping every connection within range. The second signal, the one near his row, wasn't a phone. It was a repeater, a relay device, possibly slipped into a seat panel or tray table, acting as a passive monitor. Riven stirred again. Core didn't move. Cale knew then it wasn't personal. It was procedural. A test. Possibly one Riven had done before. But why target him? And why now? He tapped a single command key on the tablet. A ghost file blinked open, an old document from his former lab partner, now deceased. It was titled Stress Patterning via Induced Companionship Disruption, and below the title, a note. Most humans break when the response system they trust most is triggered out of rhythm. Cale stared at the line. Riven, Core, him, all connected, all being triggered. He shut the file. There would be no breaking, only recording, and maybe, if Riven wasn't careful, reversal. He turned back to the diagnostic scan and stared at the stealth signal pulsing behind his seat. The enemy hadn't just boarded the plane, he'd accessed its internal systems to bait a response. Cale didn't have time to react because Riven already had. The moment Riven's fingers touched the metal clasp on Core's harness, the baby let out a single, piercing cry that cut through the cabin like a blade. It was not a wail of fear, nor the distressed moan of an infant startled by noise or light. It was high, deliberate, and vibrationally sharp, so calibrated it seemed to still the air for a moment. Cale froze. He had heard that cry only twice before, in controlled conditions. Once during a synchronized stress test involving rapid caregiver absence, and once during a trauma recognition simulation designed for animal-assisted therapy mapping. It was a signal, embedded into her early response training. A cry triggered only when Riven's subconscious registered a pattern of converging threat, external, internal, and emotional. Riven flinched, clearly taken aback by the sudden sound. "There it is," he muttered, gesturing at Core. "The dog's upsetting her. I'll have to report this as a breach." But Cale didn't even look at him. He was watching Riven, her cheeks flushed, eyes wide but unblinking, her fingers clutching the front strap of his shirt like anchors. Core had not moved, but his breathing had slowed, every inhale long, controlled, precise. Like Cale, he understood what had just occurred. The child had recognized a threat that the adult world refused to see. Cale's mind raced. He reached 2 fingers under Riven's chin, steadying her with the same gentle touch used during regulated calibration sessions. The pressure activated the embedded sync node in her collar, one designed not for broadcasting, but for burst transmission. A small green LED flickered at the base of Cale's tablet as the biometric sync engaged. 1 heartbeat later, a whisper pulse of data encrypted with layered neural ID shot through the aircraft's passive headset mesh, a signal designed only for one destination, his private ethical cloud server. The message was simple. Trigger registered. Escalate protocol tier 3. Confirm human-dog, infant sync. The attendant smirked, confident his act would go unchallenged, unaware that every second, every witness, and every sound of the baby's alert had already set the father in motion. If you believe cruelty under a uniform always folds when strategy meets unstoppable protection, hit subscribe now. because justice never hesitates. Around them, the cabin remained unaware of the subtle war unfolding beneath its hum. A few passengers glanced over, more irritated by noise than curious. Revan straightened, smoothing his uniform with a smirk. "We'll need to isolate the animal until we land. Policy states," he began. Cale's voice was calm but cut through the air like glass. "Step away." Revan didn't budge. He crouched slightly again, the pretense of compassion gone. "Or?" he asked with a curl of his lip, mockery seeping into his tone like venom. Cale leaned forward. "You know what you're doing isn't protocol. It's provocation. The only reason my dog hasn't reacted is because he's trained better than you are." Revan's expression twitched. Cale's tablet buzzed once, confirmation of successful sync burst. He didn't look down. Instead, he locked eyes with the man who had, for the last hour, carefully constructed a scenario designed to provoke. The stomp had not been impulsive. The repeated passing by had not been casual. The proximity breaches weren't missteps. They were part of a layered test. One designed to collect emotional escalation data, stress response thresholds, and infant distress signals, all under the thin veil of airline discretion. Cale had read about these programs in ethics leaks years ago. Passenger instability predictors, they were sometimes called in internal corporate docs, but he never expected to find himself inside one. Revan tried again. "We'll be forced to flag your group. Safety override applies to nonverbal dependents and animals displaying volatility." Kyle said nothing. He simply tapped his stylus twice on the edge of the tray table, an old command from his research days, used to initiate silent parallel processing in his behavioral sync systems. At once, a low-frequency scan began mapping micro-muscle shifts in Core, Revan, and Cale himself. The data fed directly into the log tree being mirrored on his off-site server. But even as his systems ran, Cale's eyes didn't leave Revan's. "You think you're observing us," Cale said softly, "but I've logged every move. Your pacing, your boot taps, your scripted language, and now you've triggered the one alarm you can't discredit." Revan blinked. "What alarm?" Cale pointed to Revan, now quiet again, her eyes still locked on Revan with eerie focus. That cry. It wasn't fear. It wasn't pain. It was conditioned calibration. "She saw what you were doing, and she warned me." Revan's smirk faltered, but he recovered quickly. "You're reaching. Babies cry all the time." "Not this one," Cale said. "Not like that. That pitch was designed to register as a signal, not a plea. You stepped into the wrong study group." Revan took one last glance around. The captain had not been summoned yet. The aisle remained unconcerned, but Cale could sense it. The window of plausible deniability was closing. Revan's breathing changed, just slightly. Cale noted the micro-tension in his jaw, the slight tilt in his stance. He knew this wasn't going to go unnoticed. Cale sat back slowly, adjusting Revan's collar and letting her head rest against his shoulder. Core shifted slightly, still in a protective down position, but now with one eye open, tracking Revan's every move. And then came the final ripple. Cale's backup server sent a silent confirmation tone to his tablet. Tier 3 incident logged. Footage from 3 peripheral cameras synced. Cabin biometric activity from 2 adjacent passengers merged. The data was now untouchable, logged, time-stamped, and sent to 3 locations: his university lab, his cloud ethics repository, and a neutral compliance board Cale had set up 2 years prior, anticipating exactly this kind of breach. Revan stood, brushing invisible lint from his sleeve. But this time, there was no smirk, and as Cale watched him walk away without another word, he knew the tides had turned. He turned slightly toward Revan and whispered, just loud enough for Core to hear too. The baby had spoken in the only language Revan couldn't fake: instinctive trust. Cale's entire body went still, but his mind ignited like a controlled burn. He didn't breathe. He didn't blink. He just listened to the cry. Riven's shriek had torn through the cabin like a whistle blast, but it wasn't chaos that followed. It was precision. That cry wasn't born of fear. It was a signal. He knew it the moment it landed in his ears with its pitch, its timing, its shape. That sound had been trained, coded into Riven during months of neural calibration. It was the exact tone they had mapped in sessions back at the lab, the identifier of composite threat synchronization. Core's ears had perked before the sound. His body had stiffened. His breathing had halted, just slightly. And Riven? Her pulse had spiked 3.2 seconds before the sound escaped. The data aligned perfectly with the signature of what Cale had named reflexive cross-bond alert. It meant both the dog and the child had processed and confirmed external danger as a shared, high-certainty input. The only variable now was whether the human observing them, Riven Doss, understood what had just happened. He didn't. Riven tilted his head like someone watching an infant tantrum. "Told you," he said, voice low but laced with fake concern. He gestured lazily at Core. "Disruptive dogs making the kid panic." Kyle turned his head slowly, one hand still resting on the edge of the carrier, the other sliding his tablet toward him with deliberate calm. "Step back," Cale said, his voice as steady as a tightened wire, "before you add obstruction of a protected protocol to your problems." Riven's expression changed, not with fear, but with annoyance. "There is no protocol," he snapped. "I've read the manifest. She's not tagged. The dog's just listed for comfort purposes." Cale didn't flinch. His finger tapped the tablet 3 times. 4 pulsing lights blinked to life on the screen, each indicating an encrypted signal bouncing across emergency compliance frequencies. One relay activated near the cockpit, another to the medical sync system built into Riven's harness, and 2 more beamed into the neural mesh embedded in Cale's stylus and the wall panel sensor behind his seat. Every incident, every physiological spike, audio sample, movement pattern was now being uploaded live into his secure behavioral oversight archive. "You're being logged," Kyle said quietly. Riven scoffed and took a single step forward. Core rose. It wasn't violent. There was no snarl, no bark. But the way Core stood, head aligned with Riven's waist, shoulders forward, front paw planted diagonally, spoke volumes to anyone who understood posture. The dog wasn't attacking. He was holding. Holding in the way military-trained canines signal, "One more move, and I will act." Riven froze mid-step. The ambient hum of the plane, the hush of conditioned air, the murmured voices several rows down, it all seemed to fade beneath the weight of that moment. Kyle spoke again. "If you touch that dog again," he said, slow and unblinking, "I'll have 3 oversight boards and 2 federal panels waiting when we land." There was no yelling, no dramatic shift in tone, just the confidence of a man who had spent his life preparing for ethical breaches exactly like this. A man who understood that silence, when loaded with truth, could crush louder lies. Riven's grin, until now his default armor, wavered. His eyes darted to the harness, to the baby whose cry had triggered all of this. Riven had gone completely still, wide-eyed but unafraid. She watched him like she knew something he didn't. And in that moment, maybe she did. Riven opened his mouth, then closed it again. Cale stared at him, not with fury, but with calculation. Every muscle in Cale's body remained taut, ready, bracing, because he didn't believe for 1 second that this was over. In fact, he knew the opposite. This was the escalation phase, the part of the script where the provoker realized he had been outmaneuvered, where data outpaced performance. Riven whimpered again, a tiny sound this time, but even that was recorded. Every micro-inflection, every emotional shift. Cale's fingers returned to the tablet. His thumb pressed a button below the display. one that uploaded a real-time flag to the ethics emergency relay grid. It carried a coded tag, intentional behavioral provocation attempt, passenger identified, evidence archived, awaiting verification. Riven glanced once more at Core, whose chest heaved in a deep, deliberate breath. Then he looked back at Kale, eyes narrowing. "You think you're special?" he muttered under his breath. Kale didn't respond, because Riven already had, and Riven, for all his posturing and rehearsed intimidation, finally understood what that cry had been. He finally understood the cry wasn't a plea, it was a command sequence, and he had triggered it. The plane had barely steadied from its second jolt of turbulence when the man in row 1 stood. No announcement, no hesitation. He rose like someone who didn't need permission. Kale's eyes tracked him instantly. The man was tall, bearded, wearing a navy blazer over compression boots that suggested recent surgery or undercover travel. He moved deliberately, neither fast nor slow, just enough to draw the attention of no one but the person he was walking toward, Kale. Without a word, the man leaned slightly, revealing a thin, matte black badge behind the inner fold of his blazer. It wasn't shown long, just enough to confirm it was real. "Saw it all," he muttered, voice steady and low. "He's done this before. Same tactics, same trigger patterns." Kale's grip on Riven's carrier tightened. Core, still lying at his feet, shifted but remained silent. "Always with dogs or infants," the man added. "Always tries to provoke a removal mid-flight." Kale's voice was calm, but his jaw clenched. "Why?" The man tilted his head toward the front of the plane, then let his gaze slide subtly toward the galley. "Because he's not just a flight attendant. He's also contracted through a behavioral escalation unit. They test passengers for reaction thresholds, especially those tied to emotional or animal regulation fields." Kale blinked, the words slicing through him like ice. His research, his field, his case studies, they weren't just relevant. They were the target. The man continued. You're a perfect profile. Traveling with a child. Documented research in multi-species bonding. A therapy animal. Emotional stakes. He knew exactly what to trigger. Kale's breath caught in his throat. "He stomped on my dog's tail." "That," the man said with quiet emphasis, "was deliberate. They monitor response time, waveform spikes, child escalation. They call it passive integrity mapping. But it's not passive. It's a trap." The cabin around them was relatively quiet. Passengers were mid-meal, half asleep, or numbed by the slow hours of cruise. But Kale's mind was roaring. He glanced toward the galley again, picturing Riven's smug face, the carefully timed passes, the unspoken threats, the moment he had leaned in close and suggested Kale switch seats with his own dog. Kale forced himself to breathe slowly. "It's illegal," he said flatly. The man nodded. "Completely, but they bury it under crew discretion clauses and vague compliance reports. As long as they can frame it as passenger instability, they win." Kale's hand moved to his tablet. "I have vitals, timestamps, audio, predictive overlays, enough to show pattern recognition beyond coincidence." The man smirked. "Perfect. I've got footage, cabin view, motion tracking, even flagged the moment he leaned into your row for excessive proximity." "Who are you?" Kale asked, keeping his voice low. "Joran Vale, auditor, Skylance Aviation. I fly about twice a week, rotate through carriers. I look for conduct breaches like this, crew members who manipulate protocols under the radar." Kale didn't respond immediately. His brain was aligning events backward, matching every strange movement from Riven with Joran's explanation. The tapping boot, the indirect threats, the scripted denial, and now, the behavioral escalation clause. Kale had read it, ignored it, thought it boilerplate. But Riven hadn't. Riven had weaponized it. "Then why now?" Kale asked, his tone a whisper barely louder than breath. "Why expose yourself mid-flight?" Joran's eyes didn't waver. Because your daughter cried. Cale blinked. That sound she made, Joran said. It triggered a pattern interrupt. She didn't scream like an infant in distress. She alerted, like a synced response to something only she and the dog sensed together. That cry forced him to escalate too fast, broke the rhythm, made him sloppy. Cale looked down at Riven, who had drifted to light sleep again, her hand still resting on Core's back. The dog hadn't moved, but he was watching, every breath controlled, every muscle tight. I saw it all, Joran said again, quieter now. He's going to try one last time. They always do, just before descent. He'll frame it as compassion, offer a blanket, maybe a snack for the baby. But it's a last poke, designed to capture final reaction spikes. Kyle nodded, his eyes narrowing. Then we intercept. I'll handle that, Joran said. You just stay steady. I've already alerted the tribunal board via soft link sync. If we catch one more trigger attempt, we have grounds for immediate review. Kyle exhaled, finally feeling the sharp pressure in his chest begin to ease. This isn't just about you, Dr. Marvin, Joran added. He's flagged 5 other families in the last 6 months. None of them caught it in time. You're the first to fight back with tech, not temper. Cale smiled faintly. Then let's finish this with both. Joran nodded once, then stepped back toward row 1, blending into his seat as if he had never moved. Cale tapped the edge of his tablet, checking Riven's harness link. Synced. Core's biometric overlay. Stable. Audio uplink. Armed. He gave a single hand signal to Core, flat palm facing down. The dog didn't move, but his eyes locked onto Kyle's. Everything was ready. They had planned a test, but forgot that some passengers test back harder. Riven Doss approached with a blanket in hand, the thin fabric folded neatly, like a peace offering wrapped in deceit. His voice was syrupy, almost gentle as he stopped beside Cale's seat. Apologies, he said, dipping his head slightly. We'd like to make it up to your little one. Kyle didn't answer. His eyes flicked once toward Core, who stood rigid and ready, positioned to intercept without aggression. His fur bristled slightly, but he didn't move. Not yet. Then, without a word, a hand reached out from the aisle and intercepted the blanket midair. That won't be necessary, said a calm but firm voice. Riven blinked, caught mid-step. His hand froze. His gaze followed the voice. Standing just off-center in the aisle was the bearded man from row 1, now close enough for Cale to see the thin green line of a biometric band running along his blazer cuff. The man's expression was neutral but unmoving, like stone behind glass. I think you've done enough, Doss, the man continued. The cabin shifted subtly. Passengers nearby looked up, quiet murmurs replaced by expectant silence. The overhead lights seemed brighter now, though they hadn't changed. Riven's eyes narrowed. Who are you? The man responded without hesitation. He reached into his inside coat pocket and pulled out a small black ID card, sleek, unmarked except for a silver triangle embossed in the center. He tapped the edge against the back of the nearest seat. A soft beep followed by a green light blinked 3 times. Joran Vale, he said clearly. Auditor, Internal Passenger Conduct Division. Riven's face paled. His grip on the blanket slackened. That division isn't supposed to be active during non-incident flights. Joran raised a brow. And yet, here I am. Your presence made that call rather easy. Cale stood slowly, his movement deliberate. Riven stirred against his chest, her small hand brushing his collar. She blinked twice and rested her head again. She hadn't cried. She didn't need to. Core sat at full alert but stayed precisely where Cale had positioned him, facing the aisle, ears forward, eyes trained. He hadn't barked once, not even when Riven had stomped his tail. I have every recording needed, Cale said quietly, but his voice carried. My daughter's cry made sure of it. Riven looked between the 2 men, the silent dog, the baby's carrier, the blinking green badge on the tablet screen behind Kyle's seat now displaying waveform logs and time-stamped overlays. He saw the trap, not laid, but earned, and his mask began to crack. "You don't understand," Revan muttered, stepping back. "I was instructed. This was protocol." "You mean threshold Tier 4? Jorn interrupted, his tone still neutral but edged. "We're familiar." Kale's eyes darkened, but he didn't move. "We never gave consent." Riven opened his mouth to reply, but then shut it, jaw tight. Joran walked past him and moved toward the galley. He activated the embedded interface panel near the crew station, placing his badge against a second sensor. The screen lit up. "Uploading now," he said, tapping twice. "My body cam. Your synced vitals. The onboard sensor pings from the rear module." He paused, then added, "Everything's going to the tribunal log in real time." Kale's hand rested gently on Riven's back. She gave a soft sigh. Kor finally exhaled, a low puff of breath, and lowered his posture. Tension drained from the space like a pressure valve had been released. Behind them, passengers leaned subtly into the aisle, watching without drawing attention. One man removed his headphones. Another held a phone in his lap, camera already rolling. The captain's voice buzzed through the speaker moments later. "Mr. Riven Doss, please report to the rear crew compartment immediately. This is a request from the command deck." Joran looked back over his shoulder, face unreadable. Riven froze in place, then turned slowly and walked toward the back of the plane. No blanket, no words. Just silence following in his wake. Kale returned to his seat and lowered himself with control, not exhaustion. He adjusted Riven's position, letting her sleep deepen. He reached to pat Kor's shoulder gently. The dog responded with a soft blink and a slow tail wag. Small, but sure. For the first time in hours, the cabin didn't feel like a trap. Joran returned and sat 2 rows ahead, tapping notes onto his device. Kale leaned back and finally let his chest rise and fall without resistance. The cry had been a warning, but the evidence it summoned was a verdict. The aircraft touched down at Delmere Skyport with a gentle, mechanical sigh, the wheels grinding against the tarmac. The engines whined as the plane decelerated, but for Kale, the routine descent was anything but ordinary. He tightened his grip on Riven's carrier, feeling the slight weight of her still fragile body against his chest, while Kor, alert and composed despite the day's tension, moved subtly at his side. The moment the aircraft slowed to a taxiing pace, a ripple of whispered speculation passed through the cabin. Passengers craned their necks, eyes darting toward the rear where the figure of Riven Doss had lingered just moments before. Then, without ceremony, 2 men in dark jackets materialized in the aisle. Their gait was precise, measured, and eerily silent, each hand brushing the seam of their jackets where the sigil of Erwin's Tribunal Oversight Division gleamed faintly in the overhead lights. Kale's eyes followed every step, his mind calculating, cataloging, anticipating. Riven stiffened the moment he caught sight of them, his posture rigid, a subtle tremor betraying his calm facade. The passengers' murmurs escalated into a mixture of astonishment and relief, some discreetly raising phones to capture the unfolding scene. The captain's voice, calm but formal, broke the charged tension. "Due to a conduct review, certain crew members will be reassigned. We appreciate your cooperation." The words felt hollow against the gravity of what had transpired, yet they carried weight for the crew and passengers alike. Riven's face paled under the fluorescent cabin lights. He straightened, lips pressed into a thin line, eyes darting toward Kyle, searching for some sign of submission or apology. There was none. Kyle's expression remained stoic, a shield of controlled resolve. Every second that passed reinforced the consequences that were finally arriving for calculated cruelty. Joran Vale stepped in beside Kale, moving with the quiet authority of someone who had navigated these situations countless times. His voice, low and controlled, cut through the murmuring passengers. "Stay close. he instructed, his gaze scanning the cabin for any unexpected interference. Kale complied, shifting slightly to ensure both Riven and Kor were aligned with Joran's line of escort. Kor, attuned to every nuance in Kale's tension, mirrored the measured pace, his tail low but muscles coiled in readiness. Riven, sensing the transition, nestled deeper against her father, her small fists pressing lightly against his chest, an unconscious echo of her trust in him. The jet bridge opened to reveal a private corridor, pre-secured by Joran, its walls muted in color and devoid of the typical bustle of airport activity. Here, away from the public gaze, Kale met with two officials from the Airwin Ethical Integrity Board. Their faces were grave, the weight of responsibility evident in the precise, clinical way they carried themselves. They did not waste words. The data, compiled meticulously from Riven's harness, Kor's physiological monitors, and Kale's own predictive behavioral models, was laid bare in front of them. Each spike, each micro-response painted a damning narrative not just of Riven's deliberate misconduct, but of a more sinister, systematic effort. The Threshold Tier 4 program. Kale's heart clenched at the revelation that such a program existed, designed to manipulate, provoke, and record passengers' emotional and protective responses without consent, with children and animals strategically placed as test variables. One of the officials, a tall man with a silver-streaked beard and sharp gray eyes, exhaled slowly. "Mr. Marvin, the scope of this program is unprecedented. These individuals were instructed to escalate passengers intentionally, capturing data for internal review. Your daughter and your dog were leveraged as unknowing subjects." His voice, though calm, carried an undercurrent of outrage that mirrored Kale's own simmering fury. Kale's jaw tightened and he glanced down at Riven, who now looked up at him, eyes wide and blinking, yet unafraid. Kor leaned slightly into Kale's side, as if to reinforce the unspoken bond of protection and trust. Kale's voice remained even, but there was steel beneath it. "Some experiments belong in laboratories, not in the aisle of a plane carrying children." The other official, a shorter man with piercing green eyes, interlaced his fingers over the dossier in front of him. "We will be suspending Threshold Tier 4 immediately," he said, tapping the table for emphasis. "A full inquiry is being initiated, and all personnel involved will be held accountable. The data you've collected will be crucial in establishing both the methodology and the culpability of those responsible." He met Kale's eyes directly, acknowledging the moral weight of the day's events. Kale nodded subtly, allowing himself the smallest exhale, a fleeting release after hours of hypervigilance and strategic thinking. As the corridor's lights reflected off polished surfaces, Kale observed Riven's absence, escorted efficiently and silently by the tribunal agents. There was no shouting, no humiliation, just the inevitability of accountability. The quiet hum of the secured lounge enveloped Kale and his companions as he finally allowed himself a moment to adjust Riven in his arms. The baby's head rested lightly on his shoulder, and Kor's paw brushed against the side of the carrier, a grounding presence in a world that had momentarily threatened chaos. In that moment, Kale realized that the battle had not been for vengeance, but for integrity, truth, exposure, and the unassailable principle that no algorithm or protocol could override instinctive trust. Kale looked from the officials to Riven and Kor, absorbing the weight of the resolution while anticipating the broader implications. The program's suspension, the inquiry, and the data, now securely in the hands of those committed to oversight, were all victories, but not the final word. Yet he felt a rare clarity settle over him. This was the point where preparation met consequence, where evidence met action. And in that quiet, contained space, Kale allowed himself to commit the moment to memory, knowing it would shape not just policy, but the ethical standards for years to come. Some experiments belong in laboratories, not in the aisle of a plane carrying children. Sometimes, the smallest voice in the room is the one that breaks the silence for good. The auditorium fell into absolute stillness the moment the cry echoed from the screen. Not a real baby's cry this time, but the playback. High, piercing, layered with something far more primal than fear. On the projection behind Dr. Cale Marvin, Riven's face flashed into focus. Eyes wide, lips trembling, that unmistakable moment just before instinct gives sound a reason to exist. The image faded, replaced by biometric overlays, synchronized spikes across her vitals, Core's muscle tension, and the data bursts from Cale's tablet interface. Silence ruled the room until Cale finally spoke. "We ask children and animals to trust us," he said, voice low but steady. "And when they do, this is what it sounds like." He didn't pace. He didn't raise his voice. He stood completely still at center stage, illuminated by a narrow cone of light at the Sovereign Behavioral Ethics Forum, the largest annual gathering of neuroscientists, aviation safety engineers, transit designers, and ethics advisors, yet none of them dared shift in their seats. Riven stirred gently in her carrier against his chest, fingers curled beneath her chin. Core, seated at Cale's side, remained still, his eyes half-lidded but alert. "What you just witnessed wasn't a meltdown," Cale continued, gesturing to the freeze frame now displayed. Riven Doss caught mid-step, boot hovering inches above Core's paw. It wasn't a tantrum. It was a response, one crafted over months of observation, reinforced through calm conditioning, and triggered only by synchronized environmental stress. He tapped his remote. More data appeared. The overlapping behavioral chart between Riven's 12-minute pacing intervals and the exact biometric surges from both Core and Riven. Then the footage, side angle, captured by the cabin terminal Jorn had accessed. The moment Riven leaned forward, the blanket in his hands, his voice rehearsed and falsely kind. Then Jorn stepping in, badge flashing, voice unshaken. And finally, the captain's quiet realization as Cale's data lit up the aircraft's internal systems like a fiber-optic nerve map. "The algorithm didn't fail," Cale said quietly. "It succeeded. Too well, but it succeeded at something no one consented to." He stepped aside. The screen now showed tribunal documentation, official symbols, Riven's reassignment order, and the program name, Threshold Tier 4. Gasps rippled faintly through the crowd, then silence again. "The dog was not the problem," Cale said. "The baby was not a disruption. The father wasn't overreacting. They were, together, the first real-world model to detect and respond to an unannounced behavioral escalation test, one they never volunteered for." He paused, then added, "And yet, they passed." From the front row, a silver-haired man in a gray suit leaned forward, visibly shaken. Another, younger, flipped open a notepad, hand trembling slightly. The live interpreter paused mid-sign, eyes wet. Cale lowered his remote and let the screen fade to black. "We cannot train trust into children and animals," he said at last, then punish them for expressing it. The room burst into applause. Not the polite clatter of academic appreciation, but a sustained, standing wave of conviction. Some clapped in silence, hands pressed together. Others nodded, eyes down, absorbing the gravity of what they'd just seen. Core didn't stir. Riven babbled softly, unaware she had just become the voice of something far greater than herself. Afterward, in the crowded corridor behind the forum stage, a man in a navy blazer approached. His badge read, Oralis Transit Systems, Director, Child Passenger Division. He waited for Cale to finish answering a question from a reporter, then extended a hand. "Dr. Marvin," he said, "we need this protocol on our routes, all of them." Kyle tilted his head. "Under one condition," he said, "no passive scans, no silent data pulls, no hidden observation. Every reading is opt-in, transparent, consented, and reversible." The man hesitated for only a moment before nodding firmly. "Done." They shook hands. In the days that followed, Cale's data modeling framework, originally built for research into cross-species empathy thresholds, was adopted into a pilot program across 5 major transit systems. His inbox overflowed. Scholars requested access. Designers wanted consultations. Policy boards issued memoranda. But it was the tribunal's final report that landed the heaviest blow. Riven Doss, permanently dismissed. 3 other male operatives identified. Threshold. Tier 4, fully suspended, pending criminal review. And a new motion introduced before the Transit Oversight Committee, the Passenger Emotional Integrity Act, mandating clear boundaries for in-flight psychological testing and biometric manipulation. Cale didn't hold a press conference. He didn't tour. He returned to his research. Quietly, steadily, and on his office wall beside degrees and citations, he hung one image, a still from the moment Riven cried out. Not screaming, not panicking, just aware. In the following month's Journal of Ethical Integration, a small sidebar entry appeared beneath a full-spread feature on passenger rights reform. Case reference EMR 309. Title: The Infant's Cry That Stopped an Algorithm. And beneath that, in bold print, sometimes the smallest voice in the room is the one that breaks the silence for good. In moments, the father intervened, protecting the dog and the child while the crew froze in disbelief. The flight attendant's arrogance evaporated instantly as authority and precision took over. If you believe real authority acts decisively, with focus and fearless action, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores abuse of authority, cruelty, and the courage it takes to protect loved ones. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage accountability, respect, and integrity in all situations.